Hello and welcome to Where the Bush is Burning. I'm your host, Tom Tice, and each week we gather together here at Where the Bush is Burning to spend a little time in having a conversation about Christ. Last week we talked about Christ's definitive statement, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And a friend of mine who lives in another state listens regularly, watches the videos, and we communicate fairly often about what's in them and how they've affected him and what he thinks of them. And in the process of the last conversation I had with him, he said, well, is this the beginning of a series on the I ams of Christ? And I tend to listen to him, tend to take his suggestions. And so I said, well, I'm not really sure at the moment when we're having this conversation, but certainly it's a great idea. Having said that, I don't know that we'll continue week after week. We might. I can't say that we won't. But I think that it really is a great conversation to have about Christ if you pick up on the various places that he says, I am. And there's a host of them in the New Testament, but if we're going to have a conversation about Christ, the I ams of Christ particularly, I believe we need to start at the beginning. And that takes us to Exodus in chapter 3. Now, those of you who are familiar with the scripture are aware that our title, Where the Bush is Burning, is a direct reference to Exodus in chapter 3. And if you look back in the videos earlier on in the piece, there is a video particularly that addresses this whole issue of why use the term where the bush is burning. That's one of the first couple of videos that we did here. So this particular one harks back, this conversation we're going to have about Christ today, harks back again to that same passage, because if we're going to talk about the I ams of Christ, it's very important, I think, that we begin at the beginning. Now, in due course of time, we'll come to how this whole business relates to Christ. But first, let me give you a little bit of a background. In Exodus, we find the introduction of Moses in the chapters preceding chapter 3. And in that introduction, of course, his mother, Jochebed, bears him during a time when Pharaoh was practicing infanticide against all the male Hebrew children. And she preserved the life of Moses, put him in the ark and put the ark in the bulrushes. And then Pharaoh's daughter found him when she went down to the Nile to bathe. And so then Miriam, his older sister, asked Pharaoh's daughter if she wanted someone to nurse the child, and she said yes. And so Miriam ran and got Jochebed, the mother, and so Jochebed ended up nursing Moses for the first couple of years of his life, and then ultimately he ended up in Pharaoh's palace, and began to be treated as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So he was really, for all intents and purposes, treated as a prince in Egypt. Now, he realized he had, of course, a Jewish background and was one of the Israelites, and so he had a tender spot in his heart for the Israelites. He saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite one day. He more or less looked both ways, and then once he realized no one was watching, he killed the Egyptian and then hid the Egyptian's body in the sand. Afterwards, the next day, he saw two Israelites who were striving against each other, and he went up and separated them, and one of them said, well, do you intend to kill me the way you did the Egyptian? And so since he realized that this was now a known thing, Moses fled, and he fled into the wilderness of Midian. So he fled into what's called the backside of the desert, the Arabian Peninsula. He was over in that part of the world. And he attached himself to a man called Jethro, and he began to tend his sheep. And so for the next 40 years, he tended the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law. So he was 40 years old when he left Egypt. He was out in the backside of the desert for 40 years. So he's 80 years old. And we think, oh, well, that's a terribly old person. Well, ultimately, he ends up living to be 120 years old. So this was 2/3 of the way through his life at this point. So he's still very active, still very capable, and at this point was managing quite well. God appeared to him in a burning bush. So he was out herding the sheep one day, and he saw this bush. Well, the bush was burning, but it was not being consumed. It was just on fire. So he said, I'm going to turn aside and see this great sight, how this bush is burning, and yet it's not being consumed. That was the place where God appeared to him. And the message God communicated to him, first of all, was that he was indeed speaking to God. He said, take your shoes from off your feet, for the place whereon you're standing is holy ground. And then he communicated to him that he wanted him to return to Egypt. And he wanted him to become the liberator of the people of God. The rest of chapter 3 and into chapter 4 consists of Moses having a stand-up argument with God. And the stand-up argument that he has with God is that he does not want to return. He offers a multitude of excuses. And in the midst of that, he asks a very specific question, which leads us to this discussion that we're going to have today. We find that he says, verse 13, then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So God addresses Moses and says, this is the name you should use. I am who I am, or some translations put it, I am that I am. He identifies himself as the self-existent one. I am. I am. That is the name I want you to tell them. So Moses takes that on board, that this is the person with whom he's dealing. This is the name he should use. And the argument goes on for the rest of the chapter and into chapter 4. And ultimately, Moses capitulates and determines that he will go to Egypt. Although it's a very strong controversy that he has with God about this. He really does not want to do this. But the significant part of this discussion for our purposes has to do with this name. I am that I am, or I am, tell them the I am has sent you to them. And that's the name he's supposed to take with him. Well, that's the first occurrence we have in the scripture of God using that name in reference to himself. Why does this become significant with regard to Christ in a conversation about Christ? In John chapter 8, Christ is in controversy with his opponents. Now, remember the Pharisees, who were the religious theologians of the day. They were the people who taught the Israelites the Bible. They were the keepers of the law. They were the teachers. They were the separatists. They identified themselves as being separate from the world. The name Pharisee means separatist. They were ardently biblically centered. Let's put it that way. They were all about the law, keeping the law. They put a hedge around the law. They put a hedge around the hedge. They added a lot of traditions. They added a lot of regulations. They were very, very much against Christ. And when Christ came and he broke some of their rules, he did things that they did not approve of. He was healing the sick. He was raising the dead. He was gathering a following. They viewed him as being the perpetrator of a sort of personality cult. They were very, very much against him. So in the 8th chapter, he is in a controversy with them, and this discussion goes back and forth towards the end of the chapter. Now then, in that controversy, his opponents make a remark, because he's talking about Abraham. He says, Abraham saw my day. He looked forward to my coming. and he was glad. And they say to him, you're not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? So they're saying to him, look, you're an imposter. You are uttering nonsense. You're not even 50 years old, and you're saying that you know about Abraham and that you have had some sort of interaction with Abraham. And Christ makes a statement. He says, verily, verily, I say to you, or truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Using the very language that we find in Exodus chapter 3. Uses the very nomenclature that God uses in Exodus chapter 3. Now, I want to make a comment about Exodus chapter 3 and the appearance there, and then also John chapter 8, because I'm obviously intending to link these two together. Throughout the Old Testament, we have a number of incidences that we would call pre-incarnate appearances of Christ, or Christophanies. That is, they are times when Christ appears, and he appears in a form before he ever came as the babe in the manger. So pre-incarnate, before his incarnation as the babe in the manger, he appears, and he appears in various ways. Sometimes he appears as the person that we call the messenger of Jehovah. Very often you find that. You find that in the case of Gideon. You find it in other instances where he appears as the messenger of Jehovah. It is Christ appearing there in a pre-incarnate form. We call those Christophanies. Now, in this particular instance, where we have the burning bush and God speaking to Moses out of the burning bush, it is a Christophany. It is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Now, he inhabits the bush, causes the bush to burn. The bush is not consumed. There are other occasions when he appears in different forms, but in this particular case, Christ appears. And the reason I say it's Christ is because he identifies himself as the I am here. Then later on in John chapter 8, he identifies himself as the I am there. Before Abraham was, I am. Uses this same reference. Now, the Jews in the New Testament, when they were having this controversy with him, rightly understood the implications of what he was saying. They did rightly understand it. In fact, they were so incensed and so infuriated that they took up stones to stone him, because they considered that what he was saying was blasphemy, because he was identifying himself as God. He was using the nomenclature with which they were extremely familiar from Exodus chapter 3, and he was saying, before Abraham was, I am. So the link between John chapter 8 and Exodus chapter 3 is very, very strong. Christ is quoting that and saying, before Abraham was, I am, using that nomenclature, applying it to himself, and thereby articulating that he is in fact God. Well, he is God in John chapter 8. He was God in Exodus chapter 3. So when we have this conversation about Christ, we have this conversation from the New Testament, but it is founded in the Old Testament. And this was a very consistent thing. You have to recognize that all of the gospel preaching that the apostles did in the New Testament was founded and based on the Old Testament. When Christ appeared in Luke chapter 24 to the two on the road to Emmaus, he began at Moses and all the prophets, and he declared to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So the foundation of Christ and his appearance in the Old Testament is very, very strong, taken up and used by Christ himself, taken up and used by the apostles. So we want to look at the Bible as a unified and coherent whole, and as a unified, coherent whole, the theme of it is the person and the work of Christ. There is only one mediator between God and man, and that is Christ Jesus. And because there is only one mediator between God and man, God speaks to us from the written word, and the written word leads us to Christ, the living word. And when Christ speaks, he is the living word who has come to communicate God's truth to us. So he's our prophet, he's our priest, he's our king. He acts as the one mediator between God and man, but he is in fact God come in human form. Now in the Old Testament, where he uses this nomenclature about himself in Exodus chapter 3, we find that this is the first occasion when he uses it, and he will then use it on a number of occasions after this. Most specifically in the New Testament, we find the I ams of Christ. It is significant for our purposes today, as we're beginning at the beginning, to reference this occasion in John chapter 8, where he has this controversy and he uses this nomenclature very specifically of himself. So what do we take out of this? What should we take away from this? What we should take away from this is that Christ is God, come in the flesh, and he understands himself to be so, and declares himself to be so in so many words. Therefore, when, for example, we come to I am the way, the truth, and the life, as we discussed last week, we're discussing Christ's self-identification. Here is how he presents himself. Here is what he says about himself. And this happens not on one occasion, but numerous occasions, all of which have various nuances. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. There's a number of occasions where we find him making reference to himself and using this formula, I am. At the outset, we want to understand that just as he identified himself as the I am in Exodus chapter 3, when in a pre-incarnate form he appeared to Moses, so he continues to identify himself as God, come in the flesh. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham was, I am. And so we want to understand him to be God come in the flesh. This was his claim. This was the proof that he offered that he rose from the dead. He declares himself to be the I am, God come in the flesh. So we honor him as that. We worship him as that. We declare him as that. This is the reason why later on Peter would say, neither is there salvation in any other. There's no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. So when we talk about Christ as the I am, here's where we're starting, is in Exodus chapter 3, where he appears to Moses. They have this conversation. Moses asks him this question, and he says, I am. Later on, he confirms that he is the I am to the Pharisees in the controversy that he has with them in John chapter 8. They rightly understood what he was saying. We should understand it as well. It's good for us to know with whom we're dealing. We're not dealing with just another prophet. We're not dealing with just another good doer of good works, another miracle worker, another preacher. We are dealing with no one less than God come in the flesh. And that's the Christ that we're presenting to you on a regular basis. So in order for you to gain the profit out of whatever we say after this, if we continue on having this discussion about the I ams of Christ, which we may very well do, here's the foundation of it. This is where it starts, and this is where we begin to present Christ to you. And we want to make much of Christ. We want to continue to set Christ before you. And that's primarily our purpose. The Apostle Paul said to the Corinthians, I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's exactly what we want to do. We want to know not anything else among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And so therefore, we declare him to you today. Now, if you've enjoyed this conversation about Christ, please like it, subscribe to the channel. We would appreciate that very much. Join us next week as we have another conversation about Christ and the will of God. If God's merciful and we have that opportunity, we want to continue to have these conversations about Christ. If you would like to get our devotional, the devotional can be found at hopeharbor.church. HopeHarbor.church is our blog site. So Hope Harbor and then .church, all one word, HopeHarbor.church. And you can subscribe to that. You can subscribe to it from the blog site, have it sent to your email. You can also subscribe to it through Substack. There, it is listed as Where the Bush is Burning. We publish there every day. Once a week, we put up an audio sermon from Hope Harbor Church. You're welcome to have a listen to that. It is just the audio. Join us again this next week, all being well, for another conversation about Christ here at Where the Bush is Burning. Like, subscribe by all means. Do make sure, as much as you enjoy having conversations about Christ, to participate with us. We appreciate those of you who have responded and told us how much good you feel that it's doing you. We want to do you good for Jesus' sake. And by all means, join us again as we have another conversation about Christ here at Where the Bush is Burning.